With firmware 1.6 on the Canon EOS R5, I was able to record unlimited 8K RAW video at 30 frames per second this weekend at 70 degrees Fahrenheit or 21 degrees Celsius in the studio. Today, I'm rerunning the test at 80 degrees Fahrenheit or 27 degrees Celsius outside. Will we get unlimited recording with auto power off temp set to high? Details coming up, but first, I encourage you to subscribe and choose all notifications so you're kept informed on the latest camera gear, news, and rumors. This past weekend, I thoroughly tested out firmware 1.6 on the Canon EOS R5. I ran test after test of all the overheat modes all weekend long, and I could not get the camera to overheat in 8K RAW at 30 frames per second, 8K oversample 4K, 4K 60, but I did get the camera to overheat at 26 minutes while shooting 4K at 120 frames per second at around 75 degrees Fahrenheit. And as I promised, I said I'd revisit those tests I performed this weekend once the weather got a little hotter. Well, sure enough, today it got up to 80 degrees Fahrenheit or around 27 degrees Celsius. So I ran 2 tests. I only had enough time to run 2 tests because basically between about 3 o'clock and 5 o'clock or 2 o'clock to 6 o'clock, depending on what the weather forecast is, that's the only time where I can guarantee a stable temperature of around 79 to around 81 degrees. And I was lucky enough to hit 80 degrees for the entire time of doing these 2 tests. So today, the only tests I'm reporting on are 8K RAW, 30 frames per second, and 4K at 120 frames per second all I. But before I get into those tests, which are quite interesting, let's talk a little bit about the environment. Let's first cover off the weather. Today it was 80 degrees Fahrenheit throughout the entire testing period for the 4K at 120 frames per second or 8K RAW at 30 frames per second. The temperature didn't deviate whatsoever. It was just absolutely the perfect day. For most of the day, it was around 21 degrees Celsius or around 73 degrees Fahrenheit. But once the sun started to come out, it ramped right up to around 79, 80 degrees and stayed there at 80 degrees for the entire testing. So I was very lucky to actually hit my numbers. It's like the weather gods were listening to me. However, I wasn't shooting in the sun. As I mentioned, it was partly cloudy or partly sunny. It depends on whether you're an optimist or a pessimist. So I put the camera in the shade so I could guarantee that the temperature, the ambient temperature, was 80 degrees for the entire test. The humidity was 50%. The Canon EOS R5 was on top of a tripod about 3 feet above the ground. I was using an Angelbird 2TB CF Express card, the Mark II. That one's capable of 1300 megabytes per second, although recording at 8K RAW, we're only using up about 325 megabytes per second. But one thing you'll be interested in knowing in the results is how hot this card got. And the answer is very hot, but I'll get to the details once we do the testing. I didn't use a card in the UHS 2 card slot, the SD card slot. I left that one completely empty. And as far as power goes, I'm powering directly from the mains. I didn't use batteries in any way whatsoever. I didn't want to run into any problems there. But as I was doing the testing, I realized, well, what if we have a brownout or a short or power goes out in any way whatsoever? It would have ruined the test completely. So maybe for the next time, I'm going to put batteries back in when I do the overheating testing for the 8K oversample 4K as well as 4K 60. So yeah, let's get to the first test results for the 8K RAW at 30 frames per second. Just to show you that there are absolutely no shenanigans whatsoever, instead of looking at my beautiful face, you're going to get to watch the actual clips that I shot of the test results from the Canon 70D. Now, there were times, because of that 30-minute record limit that we have in both cameras, I had to start and stop in order to get all the footage. Anyhow, enough of me talking. Let's cue the music. I was able to record for 30 minutes without any overheat warning. Then at 16 minutes and 46 seconds into the second recording, the first overheat warning appears, but I was able to record for the full 30 minutes. I pressed the record button after an hour for the 3rd time, and look what happened after about 2 minutes. The final red flashing overheat warning, that shutdown was imminent. In total, I got 69 minutes and 12 seconds of 8K RAW video at 30 frames per second. And now for the second test, 4K at 120 frames per second, shot in all I And the environmental settings, they're all the same. The camera settings, well, other than being in 4K at 120 frames per second, are pretty much all the same. And again, autofocus is enabled. However, if you've got a keen eye, you'll notice that I've moved the camera. And the reason for this being, well, the sun is moving and it's shifted where the shade is. So I've moved the camera once again so it's out of the shade. And again, we're recording at 80 degrees Fahrenheit or 27 degrees Celsius. Now on the first record for 7.5 minutes, I got no overheat warning whatsoever. The first overheat warning came at 5 minutes and 54 seconds. On the third and what I thought was the last recording, the red flashing light arrived at 4 minutes and 4 seconds, but it kept going for the full 7.5 minutes. The fourth recording went 1 minute 21 seconds before the R5 decided to give up and shut down, for a total of 27 minutes. There's quite a bit to unpack here, but let's first deal with the 4K at 120 frames per second. You'll remember that this weekend when I did a video, I was able to record for a total of 26 minutes at 4K 120 frames per second at 75 degrees Fahrenheit. So why would I get more time at 80 degrees Fahrenheit when shooting outdoors? Well, there's a very good reason for that. The wind picked up quite a bit at around 10 miles an hour or 16 kilometers an hour. And I believe that alone was the reason for the extended recording time. And this, well, it backs up what I've seen before. When I was testing, I think this goes back to firmware 1.1 about 2 years ago, I did a huge amount of tests. And what I noticed is when I was shooting outside, when there was any sort of ambient breeze, it greatly extended the record time. So if you're shooting outside at 70 degrees versus shooting inside at 70 degrees, you can expect to be able to shoot for longer. Now let's explore the results from the 8K RAW test at 30 frames per second. You'll remember this weekend I used a 2 terabyte Angelbird CF Express card, and at 70 degrees inside, I was able to record unlimited. I was able to fill up an entire 2 terabyte CF Express card, and that's recording at 325 megabytes per second or 2600 megabits per second. And that's pretty impressive. Now today, if I had left the 1 terabyte card in there, which is what was in the camera when I started the testing, I could have told you that, yes, today I got unlimited recording 8K RAW using a 1 terabyte card, but I stopped the testing, I removed the card, I let the camera cool down a little bit, and what I noticed was I was able to get to 1.2 terabytes before the camera shut off. So not nearly as much recording time as I got this weekend, but still at 80 degrees Fahrenheit, that's pretty impressive. And I suspect that if the winds picked up to something like 16 kilometers an hour or 20 kilometers an hour, we probably would have extended that time a little bit more. So 8K RAW, 30 frames per second, 1.2 terabytes, or was it 60? What was the actual time here? Let me go back and look at that time. Wrote it down here, 60 minutes, 69 minutes and 12 seconds. Wow. I mean, if we go back to when I first got this camera with firmware 1.0, that was not going to happen. By the time you powered it on, got everything set up, you'd be lucky to get 10 minutes of record time, and other people like Andrew fared even worse, sometimes only getting a couple of minutes. Then firmware 1.1 came along, and we were able to record unlimited 8K RAW at 30 frames per second, as long as the ambient temperature was 60 degrees. With firmware 1.6, again with that auto power off temp setting set to high, I was able to record now at 70 degrees Celsius, that would be funny, at 70 degrees Fahrenheit without the camera overheating in any way whatsoever. And at 80 degrees Celsius, we were able to get all the way up to 79. Did I say 79? I keep getting that number mixed up. It's why I write things down. 69 minutes, not 79 minutes. I was able to get all the way up to 69 minutes of record time in 8K RAW, and this is pretty impressive. However, I want to tell you about one of the limitations here. One of the warnings I mentioned in the last video is there's no new improvements to the hardware. The hardware architecture hasn't changed in any way whatsoever. It's the exact same camera on the inside. So what the firmware is doing, firmware 1.6, is they're playing with their tolerances for the algorithms in detecting the internal temperature as well as the ambient temperature. That's it. And what they're allowing things to do, it's just like tanning in the sun. Basically, they're putting SPF 2 on the camera and letting it get a little bit hotter, and hotter it does get. While the camera itself doesn't feel hot to the touch, it definitely feels warm. Wow, that CF Express card. Again, I'm using the Angelbird 2 terabyte CF Express card. It's got a metal coating on the outside. This time I was a little bit smarter. When I opened the flap, I pressed the eject button, but I didn't pull out the card, and I'm glad I didn't. I just gently touched it, and yeah, my brain told me, don't you dare pull that thing out. It's too hot. I was thinking of just pulling it out, popping it in my hand, and it was too hot to even do that. Now on the test this weekend, the card got so hot that I could hold it for about 5 seconds, and after about 5 seconds, my fingerprints were a little bit singed. I like this channel, I like you, but I wasn't about to see how badly I could burn myself, whether it be a 1st degree, 2nd degree, or even 3rd degree burn. And when you look at what Canon says when you switch it over to high mode, they do warn you that the camera or the storage can get very, very hot. So once again, it's important to remind you about the material science of this camera. The parts haven't changed, the components haven't changed, and if you take a camera from regular temperature, whatever that ambient temperature is, let's say it's around 21 degrees Celsius or 73 degrees Fahrenheit, and you run for a long period of time, well, that temperature is going to power all the way up to probably something north of 100 degrees. I don't have a temperature gun, but I can tell it's very hot. For me to actually burn myself, I know things are getting very hot on the inside. And if your temperature range is even greater, let's say it's wintertime and you're at about -10, and you record outside in 8K RAW and you do that for an extended period of time, that temperature again approaches 100 degrees Fahrenheit or 40 degrees Celsius. Well, you do that time and time again, and material science is, well, it's the whole science behind the materials, constant heating and cooling, especially with a great range, and what it can do is break down the components over time. However, it is important to notice that Canon said, well, look, here's firmware 1.6, and they didn't warn you in any way whatsoever that doing so could shorten the life of your camera. I do believe over the long term, it can shorten the life of the camera and maybe even the storage. And I'm waiting to hear back from Angelbird what their thoughts on how hard or how hot this can get. But at the end of the day, Canon spent a lot of time testing this. 2 years after the camera came out, they finally released this overheat firmware update with this setting where you can set it to high. And again, they give you that warning. So just be careful. My thoughts are because they've gone ahead and released this, they've done enough testing, and Canon is confident that at least within the first year of warranty, or 5 years in Australia, the camera isn't going to overheat to the point enough times where it's going to damage internal components, requiring Canon to, well, save face by doing a recall or anything like that, or having to pay a lot of money under repairs. So I think it's safe, but here's what I'm going to do, and I shoot videos all the time, inside and outside. I'm going to keep the auto power off temp, and it's set to standard when you first install it. When you switch it over to high, you are going to get a warning, heed that warning, but I pretty well keep it on standard all the time. However, if I am out shooting, I'm on vacation, whatever the scenario is, and I'm getting down to where it's flashing, indicating that the camera's about to overheat, and I need to get that content, well, then I'm going to switch it over to high, and it's going to allow me to record as long as I want. But for all those other times, if I can allow it to cool down, I will. And that's another important factor, cool down times. I did the 2 tests this afternoon back to back. I allowed about a half an hour for it to cool down. Now what I did is I brought it inside and cooled it off in the basement so I could get it to cool off a little bit quicker. Then I brought it outside so it would sit for another 10 minutes or so it would be brought back up to the ambient temperature. Because most of you, if you're shooting outside, you're generally going to be shooting with your camera gear already brought up to the ambient temperature. And I was amazed at how quickly the camera would cool down. And this video that I'm recording right now, I'm recording this less than 30 minutes after doing the 8K, not the 8K test, the 4K 120 frames per second test. So cooldown times are a whole lot better. This is a completely new camera than what Canon released to us back on July the 30th, 2020. So it's pretty impressive. But I'm not done yet. The next day, where the temperature goes up to around 80 degrees, where it's able to sustain that for a couple of hours, I'm going to do one more test, and that's the 8K oversampled 4K, because I think that's got to be the most useful video mode and frame rate around. I love it. It has the most detail of all modes on the Canon EOS R5. But I know some of you really like 4K 60, so I'm going to do a 4K 60 test as well. So hopefully I can do that tomorrow. But the weather's looking a little iffy. There's some threatening of thunderstorms in the forecast, but these guys don't always get things right. And now, let's take a little sneak behind the scenes. In this video, I use Fahrenheit and Celsius quite a bit. And the reason I did that is every now and then I get a lot of comments saying, you live in Canada, right? Why can't you use Celsius? Why are you using Fahrenheit? Well, this is the God's honest truth. I prefer it. I don't like Celsius. It doesn't make sense to me. It's not that I don't like the metric system. I do. It's base 10. Everything seems to make a whole lot more sense. But when it comes to temperature in the summer where I live here in Canada, I don't know what 24 is versus 27 or 26. The numbers seem foreign to me. I grew up in the South Pacific with Fahrenheit. It wasn't until I came to Canada in '79 where the metric system was in place that, well, we had Celsius. And of course it was winter, so in winter, Celsius made sense, but in the summer, you see, this is how I look at Fahrenheit. I see 50 degrees as really cold temperature. It's where you want to start putting on your winter coat or a jacket, but once it gets up to 60 degrees, I can start wearing shorts. I might still wear a jacket like this, but 60 degrees, especially if it's cloudy, I'm going to wear a jacket like this, probably pants, but as the sun starts to come out, I'm wearing shorts. 70 degrees, well, 70 degrees to me is summer. There's no way I'm wearing a jacket like this. I'm wearing shorts and a t-shirt only. And I'm playing in the sun, playing in the shade, I don't really care. But as it gets up to 80 degrees Fahrenheit, that to me is where things get rather hot. I tend to prefer the shade a whole lot more than the direct sun, or I'm swimming at a beach. And 90 and 100, well, they're severe. They're really dangerous. To me, 90 means I'm going to seek the shade, or best, I'm going to seek some sort of air conditioning hideout. And 100 degrees, well, to me, that's absolutely critical. That's going past my body temperature. I'm going to be seeking the cool air and making sure I'm staying hydrated and drinking lots of liquids. And you see, that's how my mind works. And to me, the Fahrenheit system is base 10. And what always, well, kind of frustrated me, and I thought a little bit funny about Celsius is, for it to work, Nest controls or the car that I was in would have to go in half-degree increments or fractions. So to get the right temperature in my car, I might find that 21 is too hot, but 20 is too cold, so I'd go to 21.5. Whereas with Fahrenheit, I always knew that if I set it to 70, I was always going to be happy. But if I start to get a little cold, I could bump it up to 71 or 72. I just found that the increments of change, especially when it came to heating and cooling, were just so much better. So I will try to use Fahrenheit and Celsius more often in my videos, but the reason why I use Fahrenheit is I just prefer it, and I don't care if people don't like it. I like this channel, and I like that you're watching, and I respect you, which is why I try to use both systems as much as I can. But if in doubt, I'm going to stick to Fahrenheit, and really, I prefer it. I find it more comfortable. So that's a little bit of interesting take in behind the scenes. What do you prefer? I know that most people in the United States generally stick to the imperial system, but let me know. Do you prefer Fahrenheit? Do you prefer Celsius? What is your age? I'm also at that age where I grew up under primarily the Fahrenheit system or the imperial system. And even when I came to Canada, all the news forecasting stations were still using Fahrenheit, and Celsius really didn't sort of take traction here until about the 90s. And of course, I came over in the early 80s, well, 79. But anyhow, enough of a tangent. If you want to stay up to date on the latest camera news and rumors, or videos like this, where I take a firmware update and I test it at the risk of my own camera, because I'd rather test it and have a problem happen and reach out for support than have you run into the same problem. So once again, I'm going to be testing 8K oversample 4K, as well as 4K 60. And then again, I'm going to reproduce these tests once the temperature gets up to about 90 degrees. But I don't think there's going to be any surprise. Once we have those 3 data points, we're going to start to see basically a hockey stick, and the hotter the temperature goes. And here's the thing, here's my prediction. If we get up to about 90 degrees or 100 degrees, I'm pretty sure that I'm going to shut off, I'm going to overheat, I'm going to sit down and stop recording long before the camera does. But that's it for now. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you again soon.